But our next topic, equally sort of grim. So this is more getting into the more nuts and bolts of things. And this is research articles. Slightly more ennobling than writing grants, which we'll talk about later. So research articles, this is like what we're all kind of getting into here, because the thesis and the dissertation, although cool and extremely long, will have to become an article. And those of us in the faculty level, we have to write a lot of articles. And so we're going to talk sort of a little bit about this, sort of different sorts of sides of it. Some of the stuff you might have already heard. Some of this stuff will seem like just hopelessly overthinking even the smallest, tiny, irrelevant details writing and publishing. We'll just sort of see. But the first thing we're going to hit, I think, with publishing articles, I should say my sense of all this comes from publishing articles, I guess. I was the associate editor at a peer-reviewed journal, Motivation and Emotion, for 4 years. And I just review a lot of articles, like probably about 60 a year. Like, it's one of those things why writing gets harder, because like you publish articles, the journals ask you to review, you should. Like, yeah. So the struggles of writing kind of always increase. But yeah, so this is kind of where I'm coming from. It's really just someone who does a lot of editing, does a lot of reviewing, does a lot of publishing. And I would say the first thing to really think about with articles is not the article itself so much, but where are you going to send it? Because especially people who are working on their first article, it's a good time to think of it. It's such a struggle. It takes such a long time. And you have like this fragile little, creature, this little bird. It's like, and your advisor's like, it is time to kick that bird out of the nest. And like, punt that thing. So what journal are you going to like kind of throw it at and hope that, the hawks don't catch it first? So picking a journal is sort of key. And there's so many ways to think about journals, because we know that journals vary in quality and impact. And there's so many quantitative ways of thinking about quantity and impact. And there's so many journals in every field, and it's a little bit paralyzing. And for what it's worth, I tend to think of journals as just sort of like a 3-tier system. So there's really like 3 groups. The top tier, which I think is probably about this big, these are undisputedly the best. Everyone sees these as the best. The strongest researchers in a field consistently publish there. Everyone sends their best work there. They're kind of like career makers. If you send something there in graduate school, you're kind of like, I'm totally going to get a great job if this gets published. These are journals that are blown so way out of proportion by the field at large. They often take on a kind of a mystique, and you feel that your life will be forever changed when you publish something there. And it could be true, but it's small. It's a pretty small group, but we all sort of know what those are. The biggest group, I think the more interesting group, is in some ways like the second tier, which for me is not like a derisive or negative thing. Like the second tier is, I think, where most of field's journals are. This is where most of the scientific conversation's taking place. And there's variation within all these tiers, of course, but these are all respectable outlets. So strong researchers, their work appears there. And all these journals can point to some classics. These are journals you're paying attention to. Maybe one rule of thumb is, if 5 years from now you published work there, you would not be ashamed if your advisor heard about it. You wouldn't be tempted to omit it from your CV. You wouldn't say like, I was young and I needed the money. That's why I sent it to the Nordic Journal of Music Therapy, which is actually a real journal, not in the second tier. So it's like if you're writing a paper on something and you see a paper on this topic in a second tier journal, you feel obligated to talk about it. And maybe that's like the best heuristic. Because we have this third tier, like where the angels fear to tread, right? Like maybe they don't, but they have to do their master's theses too. So these are grim journals that often people have never heard of, like the Nordic Journal of Music Therapy, the Australasian Journal of Falconry. I just made that one up. It's just whatever. Like these are, for whatever reason, low in stature, they're obscure. Often they have incredible page charges and they feel a bit like vanity presses or house organs, or for whatever reason, they're just kind of marginal. And if you've ever sort of wondered or speculated, like, is it better not to publish something than to publish it something way down there? Yeah, probably. Like, this is the journals where you actually start to ask yourself that. And I'd say it's, you're not getting a whole lot by publishing something here, because if other people are writing their papers and they see it, like, is it something we have to retrieve and cite? They'd say, well, from that journal, probably not. Because often they're so obscure, your library doesn't have access. It's frustrating anyways. So my sense is, first 2 tiers, cool. Like, that's really where you want to be. I think people get way too hung up on first tier, sort of cracking that, than they should. Because most people are publishing most of their work here. It gets a lot of attention. And if you're going to conferences and publicizing it, people will hear about it. And having a well-rounded body of work across a lot of journals is ultimately what's going to get attention. Like, the days when one single paper on a topic in the very best journal makes a career are so over. There's just too many people doing too much work in too many journals. So I think people shouldn't get overly personalized or overly, like, ego invested in this stuff. But that still leaves the question of, like, how do you pick one of these things? Because there's a lot of journals. And so one tip that you hear a lot that I think is maybe a little oversold is to look at your own references. Just look at what you cite, and then maybe you can send your work there. So one thing that's wrong with this, I would say, is we're going to talk about later, is you should have picked your journal before you wrote it. So you shouldn't find yourself in this position. But also, this will point you to some very strange places. So this was from something some friends and I published. It got published in Schizophrenia Bulletin. We cite very little from Schizophrenia Bulletin. And if we looked at the most common outlets in our references, it would be invited book chapters from the 80s. Like, mostly in clinical work, you'll say, you should really submit this to the DSM-4 text revision. You cite that a lot, right? So mostly it points people to, like, the biggest journals, because the biggest journals get the most citations. So for all papers, it tends to point people to the journals that they cite the most, which are the biggest journals. It might not be the best fit. So I think the other way to do it is, frankly, the more sociological, symbolic interactionist, kind of just gossip, dirt gathering. Like, this is my own sense of it, that there's a lot of quantitative metrics of how good journals are, but ultimately what matters is, like, does the community you want to be a part of value the journal? Like, what do people think of this journal? Because really, if people think a journal's good, then it's good, and that's all there is to say about it. Because fortunes rise and fall on these different quantitative metrics, but if the people who are in a position to read it and cite it and hire you and all this kind of stuff think the journal's good, then it's good. And you see this in particular when new journals are created. Because when a new journal is created, it could be 7 years before they get quantitative impact factors. And sometimes a new journal comes out and all the best people start saying their best work there, because maybe it's associated with the professional society or the editing team is really good. Other times the new journal just kind of languishes. So I think the community sense of how good a journal is what counts. Now, it's easy when you've been around the block a few times, mostly like chased around the block by the mean editors. But so if you're new and starting out, you need to kind of cultivate a sort of a very gossipy interest in journals that mostly comes from, like, counting people who've been around a while, like, hey, what do you think of that place? Or, hey, where should I send this? Or it really builds character to pick about 8 journals that interest you in your field and just read the last 2 years' worth of tables of contents. Like, you'll really know what these journals publish, like what their flavors are, what their emphases are, what they're up to. You could use this as, like, a really great procrastinating tool. Be sure to do it at a time when your advisor is going to, like, wander through the workspace. It's like, what are you doing? It's like, oh, I really want to see, what's. They'll be impressed. So, but it's very illuminating, because the journals all do have sort of different emphases, and this will kind of help. Now, we mentioned earlier, you sort of want to start early when picking a journal. It's really never too early. So I think, especially people starting out, like graduate students, people in the tenure track, it's worth looking at this in a horribly overthinking way. It might be valuable, is to do a bit of like Vita stalking of people. So you think of someone who's been around maybe 10, 15, 20 years whose work you like and who does work that's sort of similar to work that you would like to do. And you go to their web page or type it into a database and just look at where they've been publishing and what they've been doing and see like what kind of publication portfolio does this person have. It's really illuminating. Essentially, you're doing a kind of a role modeling or social learning here, right? Like you're saying, so this person's been successful. First, what you'll see is they publish much less in the absolute best journals than you think they do. They publish in a wide range of journals. They might be publishing things like book reviews. They might be publishing a lot of invited chapters. Maybe they've written books. Maybe they've edited books. You can get a sense of the more, like, what's the shape of their publishing look like? Like, this will give you some ideas, maybe. Like, maybe you never thought of writing a book. Maybe you thought about edited book chapters. Maybe you never thought of case reports. It'll reveal a lot of journals you might not have thought to send your work to. And the idea is, since these people are established and successful, these would all be legitimate outlets for the most part. Like, this will give you a sense of maybe what's kind of good. It also gives you a sense of maybe how you want to position yourself as a researcher. And this is valuable to think of early on. Like, what kind of, I wouldn't really want to say like brand. It sounds like very like business guy, like, what's your brand, you know, sort of thing. But like what kind of scholar do you want to look like? Like when you're applying to PhD programs, when you're going on the tenure track, when you're applying for grants, like what sort of science do you want to be seen as doing? So where I work, we have a big sort of child mental health emphasis. And so a lot of the students work in, for example, they do a lot of cool work in the schools. And we have a school just for refugee children called the Newcomer School. And they're primarily political refugees, economic refugees, largely from Southeast Asia. There's about 40 or 50 languages spoken in the school. I mean, these are new refugees. Like, they arrived in the nation last week. And they're put into school with peers, often none of whom speak their language, coming from horrible contexts. It's very interesting in a lot of ways. It's like a sort of a rich context for study. So the students are now just starting to develop publications out of this. They're like, where should I send this? And I was meeting with one of them. He's like, studying kids, I could go to the developmental psych journals. I could go to child clinical journals. I could go to cultural diversity, ethnic minority journals. I could go to school psychology journals. Like, I just said, you're on the job market in 4 years. Like, what kind of job do you want? Like, do you want to be a school psychologist kind of job? Do you want to be child mental health, school psych? I mean, you just sort of pick. And so thinking about the journals this way, thinking about sort of as, I don't know, embodiments of like a community that you're trying to influence, or embodiments of a community you want to be a part of, it's a good thing to think about early on. In some of my own work, I mostly do psychology, I do a little bit of psychophysiology, and I've been sending, that could go either way, but I send it mostly to the psychophysiology journals because I'd like to submit more grants with collaborators that use this. And it would be helpful on my bio sketch for the grant to list publications in psychophysiology journals, because it just gives me some cred as a psychophysiologist, even though my knowledge of psychophysiology, I will confess, is woeful and a little sad, but that's okay. That's what learning looks like. So this is just food for thought. It's kind of food for thought, that you're publishing, it's not just to get a publication out there. You're trying to situate yourself within this really big conversation of what's happening. So it's worth a bit of reflection on, basically just copying what people are doing. Now, we've mentioned earlier here, so when do you want to pick this thing? And we have mentioned already, fast, as early as possible. Something that I think people pick up as undergrads in like a research methods class or something like that. People pick up this idea of it's like the Acme paper. You know, it's like this manuscript. It comes in like a yellow wrapper. It says article on it. You know, like the generic, off the shelf, just plain vanilla research article. And in APA style, it has an introduction that's a certain length. And it has method. And it has results. And a general discussion that ends with limitations and future directions. Then it has a lot of references and things like that. Now this is bad. Like, this is really bad. Like, writing a paper and then deciding where to send it is so counterproductive. Because first there's like the obvious point that journals have such different length requirements. Like some say we really need this to be less than 2,000 words, 3,000 words, 10,000 words. Like you really sort of need to know where you're going. But also, again, the journals want to see different kinds of things, right? Like any piece of work could be pitched at different kinds of communities, and you have to pitch it to the community that you want in a way that's persuasive. So you need to cite work from that journal to talk about the kind of concepts they care about. And you can't really do that if you just write it up and then sort of choose where to send it. But I would say, and this strikes some people as sort of bizarre, but we really actually do this, and a lot of people do it, you really should pick where you want to send your work before you conduct it. So before you actually do the research and you're planning it, you should think like, where do we want to send this? And this does have the whiff of madness about it. This really sounds like over-planning and being like scary super control guy, but it makes a sort of sense in that thinking about what journal you want to send it to gives you a chance to actually craft the work to persuade that audience. So for example, some journals in my line of work, they will only take clinical samples. Like that's it. You need structured clinical interviews, you need diagnosed samples, that's just the way it is. Some need only community samples, some are happy with college students. So if you'd really like to send work to the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, because it's a prestigious journal, it'd be cool, well, you have to have clinical samples. And so when you're planning a study, you could think, well, if we'd like to send it there, and if that's the audience we'd like to catch, we have to do what we're going to do differently. And obviously, before you do the research, this is like your only chance to do it differently. It's like your only chance to say, all right, we're going to shift things here. And so this is how work gets into the best journals. It's not that someone did something really excellent and sent it there, but rather when planning it, it's like, what would this have to look like to get into that journal? So it's backwards. Like you're thinking of the audience you want to reach. So maybe it would have to have 2 time points instead of 1, or community members rather than college students, or clinical samples rather than non-clinical samples. Maybe it would just have to have, maybe we'd have to have mixed methods rather than just quantitative methods. So whatever it is that tends to happen in those journals, before you do it is the only chance you'll have to modify it. And then you could maybe get a collaborator or think about whether it's worth it. I think it's also a quality control check or a realism check that lets you think, is this idea good enough to do? Because if you think, okay, where would we likely publish this? If it's in that sort of grim, like demilitarized zone between like tier 2 and tier 3, you probably have better ideas. Like there's probably something else that's more worth your time that would kind of be higher up in the journal pecking order. So it's a way of thinking of, in the vast opportunity cost of research, where working on one paper means not working on some other paper, is this going to have the impact that I want so that it's worth doing? So it's really never too early. That's a spooky thought. If you're already working on your thesis, it's like too late, so like, forget it. But it's too late in so many ways. But there's always other projects. There's other things to do. Like it's just food for thought. So we do this a lot. We often think a few journals down the list, like, okay, we'd send it there. If they reject it, we'd send it there. If they reject it, we'd send it there. And that sounds also over planning and scary. But if you pick 3 journals that have similar length requirements or similar format requirements, you don't have this yo-yo editing of that journal wants it 8,000 words, that wants it 2,000, and wants it 2,000 in this scary non-APA format. Oh, they rejected it. Let's go to this other place that wants it at 5,000 in traditional APA references. Got to rewrite the whole thing. So picking 3 similar journals that have similar formatting requirements saves a lot of time. So these little bit of early end reflection, like really saves a lot of time. Like it's really better. But I'll say mostly what's on people's minds when it comes to talking about journals. They're like, yeah, reflection, big picture, career positioning. Seriously, I gotta publish that thing. And often this is because I don't want them to reject it. And we're not gonna say anything about rejection except just get the hell over it. if like it's just what it is. You don't even have to choose to get over it. You will simply get over it because you're going to get so much of it that, you know.
Failure is part of success. So you just
Yes,
keep that in mind.
it is. It's just, you know, they reject 30% or 70%, they take 30%. We have a 30% chance of being that 30%. It is what it is. So, yeah. But at the same time, you're much more likely to get your work accepted if it's stronger. So overall, like at Motivation and Emotion, I think we accepted about 30% of what we got. And 30% does not sound very good. But I would say 30% of what we got was craziness. Like weird, just intellectually deranged work. Like, and if you've ever done a lot of ad hoc reviewing or peer reviewing or worked as an editor, it's ugly out there. Like you learn that there's a barrel and that you can scrape the bottom of it. And if you scrape hard enough, you'll smash through to a whole new barrel underneath that barrel. And there you'll find like the Italian psychiatrist submission on his own theory of emotion, all captured in like 9 pages. You're like, since Darwin's work in 1872, we've got like 130 years of thought on emotion science, and this touches on none of that and sounds crazy, so reject. So I would actually say if most articles are rejected because they simply don't fit. They don't fit in content, like people pick the wrong journal. They don't fit in the style. And you might think the sort of style is fixable, but sure, it's fixable if that was their only submission that year, but why work with people who send stuff that's so weird when there are other people who are sending you exactly what you want? So if you think that, if you exclude the 30% that has no chance, your chances are probably 40 or 50% of getting accepted if you send something that's really relevant. And so this gets us into how to like exert your Jedi mind control powers over reviewers and editors. It's sort of simple. And again, it takes us to modeling. It takes us to social learning, to social observation. This sounds like really concrete and obvious, but I do this, for example, with honors students I work with who are writing honors theses in their first publications with grad students. And I do this myself when I'm developing an article for a journal I've never sent to. So you just want to make your article look like what the journal publishes in kind of concrete and superficial ways. It will make the article better, but you want to make it look like it. So, as bad examples, so there's a nice tier 2 journal in psychology, the Journal of Research and Personality. It publishes some nice work. I was asked to review a paper for it not that long ago. It was by a really good friend of mine. I was like, okay, I'll do it. I'm curious to see how this guy's handling his material. Journal of Research and Personality would really like your paper to be 3,000 words to 5,000 words. And this paper, all in, with tables and figures, title page, it was 92 pages. And I was like, I'm not sure I could be friends with this guy anymore. Like obviously, he just didn't care, or he just did not want to take the time. I mean, it's a huge waste of time. It was an easy review to write because I said, wow, this is a cool idea, but I'm not even going to bother reviewing it because any version that could be published here would have to be 1/8 the length. So there's no point commenting on something that will get cut. Chop it down and send it back. And I'm really surprised the editor even sent it for peer review. I wouldn't have done it. There's one another week is for a journal called Self and Identity. Short stuff, 20, 30 manuscript pages most. This was 65 pages. All the reviewers said, this is so long. Like this journal never publishes things that long. So this is like what we mean with fit. And in all these cases, the ideas were exactly what that journal wants to publish in terms of the substantive content, but you can't divorce the substantive content from its superficial structure. So I'm talking like, when you're really first starting out, it really helps to do things like how many paragraphs are in the intro? And are there any headings? Now, the reason why you can really analyze the papers in a journal like this is because they're not like randomly sampled from a universe of papers. Like they end up in the journal the way they are because the editors told the authors, do this, like, do it. And so essentially, the published articles sort of obliquely reveal the editor's preferences. So for example, it's common in clinical journals to have a table that describes the sample's demographics. You don't get that in social psych journals, so it just is what it is. So if you're going to send a clinical journal, do it. Some psychophysiology journals, they want to see tables of baseline physiological values. It mystifies me somewhat, but cool, done. Throw that in there, right? Some journals always have appendices. Like in cognitive psychology, a sort of cool and dark and geeky field, there's always appendices for things. But most journals, nope. You send it with the appendix, the editor will say, chop it, don't care. Footnotes, a lot of authors are really enamored of footnotes because there's like a point they want to make, but they're not really committed to it. So they just like throw it in a footnote and like, whew, okay. And the editors will say, kill it, like move it in the text or kill it. But you don't have to kind of second guess this, because if there generally are not footnotes in the articles in this journal, don't do it, right? If there's a lot of tables, you can have a lot of tables. If you always see confidence intervals and effect sizes, don't send it without it, because the editor's just going to say, put in confidence intervals and effect sizes. So it's cool. You really don't have to guess. Like, you can use what that journal publishes to tell you what the editors want to see, and you just do that. And I can tell you, having done a lot of editing, you're just like, perfect. Like, it's a myth that stuff doesn't get accepted as it is. Stuff definitely gets accepted as it is. It's happened with some of my work a few times. As editor, I took a couple things as is a couple times. There was a paper I was an ad hoc reviewer on the other month, and I read this paper and I was like, this is great. I mean, it was the right length, the right content, it was relevant, it's just well done. I just wrote, I feel like a fool for saying this, but you could just take it. I mean, it's really good. Like, I feel like I have to pick some nits, but I mean, just you feel like stupid, because being like overly critical and rambling is kind of what we do. But there were 3 reviews. One of the other guys said that too. One of the other reviewers said, just take it. This is great. And the first person just had some minor stuff. So it does happen. Like, when you see stuff that really just clicks and fits, they'll take it, or they'll just want minor changes. So this kind of really concrete thing, food for thought. Like, it's worth doing this kind of modeling. Now, the other thing I would suggest is more of a rhetorical stance or rhetorical approach. And this is to be persuasive rather than descriptive. So what I mean by this is you want to focus on your strengths rather than your weaknesses. I think in undergrad school, and particularly in grad school, we tend to have this weird like cult of humility, where we want, especially master's theses, we want this sort of like self-mortification of limitations, like where people just go on this long, woeful rant. It's the classic like vanity and humility. Like, even though I spent years on this, here's all that's wrong. And it just starts to get, sort of perverse and unserious, because it's like, well, if we had different measures, it probably would come out differently. And if we had a bigger sample, and if we used like harder measures, like biological measures, or peer reports, and it was just cross-sectional, it wasn't longitudinal. And really, if other better researchers did it, it might have come out better. You know, and if you take seriously the idea there's like an infinite number of possible universes, in 5% of them it wouldn't have been significant, but it wasn't ours. And you really never know which like random infinite universe you're sampling from, so the end. And like, that's what you leave like the reader with. And you're just like, okay, creepy. I don't know why people do this. Now, if you're looking through the journal, and a lot of social science journals, they want some discussion of limitations, play some context, we would have that section. If there's usually a heading for it, we would have a heading for it, because we want to like rip off these structural elements of articles so it matches well. But still, we want to be persuasive and focus on our strengths, because I would actually say, it sounds like crazy talk, I believe that no published work has limitations in the sense people mean by it. There's really only two things that can happen. Like, work can have a fatal flaw where any serious person would not publish it. Or it has enough strengths that it's worth the time and effort to try to reach an audience with it. And so for this kind of work that's not fatally flawed, there really aren't limitations. Like one person's limitations are another person's introduction, or another person's grant proposal. Like, this is just the way it all works. Like, it's perfectly sensible to start a study with a single time point, cross-sectional design, with kind of a convenient sample that's mostly self-reports, because it's low cost and you can kind of get a sense if you're on the right path, rather than do a hugely expensive and also very invasive in terms of people's privacy and lives, longitudinal study with clinical samples that maybe puts people at some sort of risk, right? I mean, it's simple to start small and get big. And the limitation of the small work is simply a motivation that prefigures like a bigger work. And so you'll probably talk about limitations, but keep it short. Keep it short. My students are working on master's theses, and they all kind of put in like this limitations and future directions heading. I was like, why don't we change that to strengths, limitations, and future directions? Like, just talk about your strengths as part of this. Or when you're talking about, make all limitations future directions. Because if you just say it's a limitation, it's just a problem. But if you talk about it in terms of prefiguring and motivating future work, that because we did it this way, it seems to be a limitation, but it does suggest it's valuable to do it this other way, cool. Likewise, I think just in the introduction in general, you want to just talk about why it's important. Like, in the discussion, talk about why it's important. It can be really bald and obvious, like, this work is important because you don't see that often. Like, a lot of people never really make the case for, here's why you should care. Like, this is important for these reasons. But then they go on and on about all of its limitations, which kind of leads the reviewers to think like, eh. So I think being persuasive rather than descriptive, like instead of just, you're kind of like lay it all out there on like a blanket at a flea market, hoping the reviewers kind of stop by and take interest. You have to try to sell it. Like, so really focus on the strengths, because there are strengths. There's, like, if you did it and followed through with it and still think it's good enough to publish it, it has a lot of strengths. And so you need to push it and push it and push it and push it. It sounds strange, but no, maybe it doesn't. Maybe actually you just have to let out your inner flamboyant, grandiose, hypomanic side and just think awesomeness, strengths, good. And I would really encourage that. It really helps. It's a bit hard to describe given that people are covering so many other things. But if you thin out the limitations and at least one point say, this work is important because, that alone I think will give you a big oomph and a big boost. So don't let your modesty, especially your graduate student modesty and humility, undo you. But maybe the kids these days aren't that modest and humble. I'm not sure. Now, one of our final things in terms of the mechanics is resubmit. So you send something to a journal, only a couple things are going to happen. They're going to reject that sucker, which is the most likely thing, or they're going to invite you to resubmit it, which is somewhat less likely. And a lot of people, especially starting out, they look at resubmission the wrong way, because a lot of these revise and resubmit letters are really discouraging. It's kind of like we just got one a couple days ago where first reviewer, like, gosh, this seems sort of warmed over. Like they just had this random data laying around. I was like, oh, God. And the other reviewer was like, I have no idea what they're trying to accomplish here. It's like, oh, yeah, it's okay. You actually get over it. Like, it's okay. It's gracious of you. But after about like you're thinking of dinner, like last night, like I've probably gotten like 200 rejections. It's just a constant fraction of how much you publish, and it's okay. Yes. Okay. Cool. Okay, thanks for reminding me. She's like my timekeeper because I'm totally confused. So you kind of get used to it. But the editor said, well, If you can revise it and make some changes, go for it. So even with something that discouraging, I would sort of think, okay, because it helps to keep in mind, editors are not encouraging you or suggesting you revise and resubmit because they feel bad about rejecting you and they don't want to do it. So they're just going to say you could revise it, but they hope you don't. Because I will tell you, having edited, rejecting people is what you do. And you don't feel bad about it. Like, sometimes there might be some small twinge or pang, like, oh man, it's a cool piece of work, and this person is probably going to like quit science forever and go be a Sherpa. But reject, it's just what you do. So if they are asking you to revise it, even if it seems horribly discouraging, that's qualitatively different from rejecting. They will just reject it if they don't want to see it. Like a revise and resubmit, even a grim one means, I think you can pull this off. Like some journals have a bit of a reputation of maybe stringing people along, but not very many. And if you are getting the dirt on journals, you'll probably hear about it. The best of the best of the best sometimes string people along, but it's rare. Like for the most part, you don't ask to see it again if you don't want to see it again. And so resubmit. Like it can feel discouraging. It's tempting to think, let's just go somewhere else. Maybe they'll like it more. Maybe, but in the long haul, you just gotta do it. You can't always try a new place because the first place came across meaner than you had hoped. It's just, there aren't enough journals for that, for one, but it's just the way it works. Papers really get better from being revised and resubmitted. It's rare that they point out flaws that are so severe that they fall in the spadal flaws area. Just revise it, resubmit it. I'll tell you, once it's actually published, it's like my wife has said of like forgetting the pain of childbirth. Like, once it's actually published, you're like, oh yeah, that was a cool paper. Yeah, that was, sent it there, got the reviews back, made some changes, and like it's just kind of like, like really, you forget. Yeah, you just sort of like, So at the time, it all seems like so high drama, but it's perhaps as much like a middle school breakup. Not while you're in middle school, obviously. So our final thing for this part is I'll just sort of mention one of the blessings and curses of the kind of research we do is that it's done with other people, right? My friends who are historians, they write alone. They write big, long books alone, whereas we work in very large collaborative networks. They're very happy to work alone because as one of my, a good friend of mine who's in medieval French history always likes to say, as Jean-Paul Sartre said, hell is other people, right? And I'm like, dude, I'm on this multi-site grant. I can tell you which people. I mean, all been there, right? So sometimes that person might be the advisor who you give the manuscript to, and it takes you just need their okay on it, and maybe it takes 4 months or 5 months or 6 months. Sometimes it might be the graduate student, but oh man, working with co-authors is really, man, this is just woe upon woe. And there are ways to write in groups that are faster and better. And it's something I'm really interested in, of like how do good teams work? And so one thing I'll suggest, this is just really qualitative. I'm just always asking people what's working well, what's not working well, things that have failed for me and sort of worked well for me. I'm always curious to know what people think. Is really when these things go disastrously badly to the point where people are moved to like grievous acts of violence, is people are spreading out the writing. Like I met some people. So an NIH grant proposal, it really has like 4 main sections. And you will often have 4 investigators or 5 investigators. It seems very natural to meet and say, all right, you write that part, and you write that part, you write that part, you write that part. Does that sound good? Everyone's like, yeah, done. There's the variation, which is you write the intro, you write the method, you write the results, you write the discussion. Done. Yeah, because 4 people, that has to be 4 times as fast. Yeah, it has to be. It's just common sense, really. We'll just each write the parts, stitch them together, slap that mother out to a journal, done, right? But obviously it presumes much. It presumes that everyone writes at the same rate. All the sections are the same length and difficulty. And what tends to happen is everyone goes, got it. Good, I can put this off for a few days because they're going to start writing and then I'll catch up. And you get people in this kind of standoff where everyone's waiting for everyone else to write. Like, probabilistically, one person will always be slower than everyone else. Everyone else gets like mad at this person. Then this person like feels sort of tense and starts avoiding the other people. And so in teams that work really well together, there's usually one writer. So it's really worth thinking like one person writing a first full draft. The most common variation that I think can really work well is someone has special statistical expertise and they might write part of the results section, all the results section. But for the most part, one primary writer writing the first full draft. And then it goes to the team. And so one thing that we use is we use Dropbox, like sort of like collaborative file sharing kinds of things. You can use network stuff, Google Docs. We like Dropbox because it's a little better with its security and privacy. I've never really trusted Google to do the right thing with Google Docs when you're doing like HIPAA-compliant depression trials and crap like that. But they can use network space, university shared network space. Anything so that when you are done with this thing, you do not send it as an email attachment to your 6 co-authors saying, hey, read this, tell me what you think, use track changes. Yeah, and they all do. And then you get like 8 files with different dates. And yeah, this is like bad. So with collaborative stuff like network space, Dropbox, Google Docs, you say, hey, it's in this Dropbox folder, it's in this network folder, work on it. And so there's a single document, everyone's working on a single document. It's so much better and faster. It's much more real time. You can even say, you do it first, you do it first, you do it first. The other thing that we do, and this is, I will admit, much more controversial, but you see it a lot, and I raise it as food for thought, is we, in a lot of teams I know, we use opt-in commenting. So what we mean by this is, like I've got a couple teams I work with a lot, and it is a blessing to work with people who are really tight, and I feel that they've helped my game a lot. But what we do is we say, all right, the first draft's done, it's in Dropbox, like we talked about, we're going to send it to this journal in 10 days. Get to it before then, if you'd like to say anything about it, basically. So it's opt-in. You're not waiting for anyone. Like no one is going to hold the whole thing up. Like if you have anything you want to say about it, say it, and in 10 days it's going to get submitted. So it sounds severe because sometimes people don't get to it. But that's kind of okay because you don't have to make small comments on a paper to be an author. Like just you've contributed conceptually, done other kinds of things. And it's okay. You can catch it on the revision resubmission. It's okay. Like at the times when my kids were born, when these things came out, I sent emails like, I'll catch you guys on the revision. I just can't get to this now. And they're like, cool. You know, people always respect saying no and not having to wait for you. And in good teams, it's really never an issue. Like knowing that there's a deadline gives it some urgency. You submit it, it shows you mean business, it's done. This works great. Sometimes people are afraid to do it, especially with people who are more senior or people who are super slow. But many people have told me that those people come to like respect them a lot and want to work with them even more, which is bad because you really don't want to work with people who are always holding you back. But such is the nature of dysfunctional behavior that because some person said like, man, they just said, wow, you really know how to execute. That's great. I got some other ideas. It's like, I basically just like pulled the paper out from under this dude and submitted it without his input, and he thinks this is great. I'm like, well, you know, like a lot of people have never been called on their bad habits, and they like respect that you did it. So I suggest that as just food for thought in co-authoring, like having the primary person, no version control madness, opt-in, like this will solve a lot of woes. This will really solve a lot of woes. Now with that said, that's sort of, I guess, our time for this part. Maybe we should have a break and we can then catch up, start with some questions after, and then keep talking about stuff. Plan.